For Markham Unionville.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to share my time with the member from Scarborough-Guildwood. The debate has gone on some time. It's coming close to an end, and I think it's become clear certain points on which we seem to be all agreed and certain points on which we may not agree. I'd like to use my time to talk about where we seem to agree on facts, where I think we're pretty unanimous in agreeing on certain actions that should be taken. But where I think we may not agree is whether this is all just words or whether this government is actually doing something to help resolve the situation. And my impression is it's mainly just words, and I question where is the beef. But before I get to that point, obviously we agree and we deplore the frequent atrocities against the Coptic Christians. Just to mention a few, on January 6, 2010, 7 were killed. On January 1, 2011, 23 were killed in front of the Coptic Church in Alexandria. And most recently, on October 9, 2011, 25 Coptic Christians were killed, more than 300 were injured, and there's evidence of military gunfire being present. So obviously there's no disputing those facts, and I've only mentioned a few of the cases. I think we all condemn these acts. That's obvious. I think that all of us would call for an investigation into the tragedy of October 9th, an investigation that is ordered by the United Nations and clearly independent of the Egyptian military. I think we all would agree that there should be independent observers at the upcoming Egyptian election. And I would be astounded, Mr. Speaker, if this motion now before the House did not pass unanimously. But it's not a great achievement to be in agreement on those things I have just listed, because I would imagine that 99-point-something% of Canadians would agree with all of that. I believe any reasonable person would agree with the list of recommendations that I just described. So the issue is not whether we agree with these things. The issue is whether the Government of Canada can do anything effective to help to bring about these improvements which we all want. You know, we can pass this motion. Maybe it'll get some attention in the Canadian media, but if that's all that happens, it won't have any impact at all on what happens in Egypt. And so I am skeptical that the government is doing anything significant to actually help the situation. The previous speaker listed one of his things that the government did was Canadian government condemns massacre. Well, what do you expect the Canadian government to do? Any government in the world, except maybe the government of Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi, would condemn a massacre. But what does that do? In and of itself, that doesn't do anything. So I'm a bit skeptical, too, about this Office for Religious Freedom. It has a budget of $5 million. That might sound like a lot of money, but in a $500 million government, $500 billion government, no, I got my numbers wrong, $200 billion government, that's small potatoes, and as one of my colleagues said, it might fund a few staff, a few visits, a few studies, but the Associate Defense Minister said this little office could call up the United Nations and get action. That makes no sense. The person who should call up the United Nations, the Secretary General of the United Nations, is the Prime Minister. And the other agency that should be contacted is the United Nations Human Rights Commission. And we have evidence from a meeting 2 days ago at a Foreign Affairs Committee that an official said that he or she had no knowledge of any such communication. So we can pass all the motions we like, Mr. Speaker, but if they just stay in Canada, and if the leaders of this country, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Affairs Minister, do not get on the phone and talk to those who might actually effect real change, then effectively it's just talk. Effectively, we all have good intentions, but unless those real actions are taken, Mr. Speaker, then nothing real will happen, and that is my concern. Thank you.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank my friend, the honourable member for Markham Unionville. I put this question to you with some trepidation because I do try very much to maintain as much as possible a nonpartisan approach, particularly when we're so unified. But I'm troubled by, I'm wondering what kind of influence we have with the government, the new government of Egypt. We didn't play a role in encouraging Cairo Spring. I cast my mind back. I remember that I was the only leader of any of the parties that said that we should pressure Hosni Mubarak to resign. And when he was toppled, the first comment by our Prime Minister was, well, I guess you can't get the toothpaste back in the tube. So there wasn't a sense that we were building a strong relationship with that new government. And I wonder if you have a sense, if we're building that now, and again, I apologize for bringing back what the Prime Minister's comments were at the time. He certainly took a lead in Libya. But in Egypt, we didn't. And I'm wondering if the honourable member thinks that will affect our ability to influence this government to protect the lives of Coptic Christians.
The honourable member for Markham Unionville.
I thank my colleague for her question. I think it's a really good point. I'd forgotten about that, but I do remember that comment by the Prime Minister back then. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. It hardly seemed an enthusiastic endorsement of the Arab Spring in Egypt. Now, I seem to remember our leader was a little more positive than that, but the Prime Minister is the one that really counts in foreign relations. So one cannot undo what happened in history, but clearly I would think that comment or the lack of enthusiasm that he displayed would not be a positive in our ability to exert influence on Egypt, but we have to work with what we've got and do our best given where we are.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'd like to respond to something that this member raised in his comments and several other members have raised, and that's with respect to the preliminary budget for the Office of Religious Freedoms. They've quoted the number $5 million, and what I need to tell them is two things. One is that it is our hope and expectation that 90% of that $5 million annual budget will be used for programs to actually protect religious minorities around the world, including Coptic Christians in Egypt. And secondly, he should know, I would think he would know, because he's a wise man, he should know that the U.S. Office of Religious Freedoms has an annual budget of $10 million, and the size of the U.S. economy compared to the Canadian economy is roughly 10 times the size of the Canadian economy. Typically, any Canadian organization would be about 1/10 of the size. We've already gone 5 times beyond that. But that's the starting budget. We're working with religious communities across Canada to decide what kinds of programs will actually be effective in protecting religious freedoms around the world. So here's my question to that honourable member. He was a member, in fact, he was a minister in a government that ruled this country from 1993 to 2006. The U.S. Office of Religious Freedoms was created in 1998. I'd like him to explain to this House why they didn't create this Office of Religious Freedom to protect the Copts.
I'm going to have to stop the Parliamentary Secretary there to allow the member for Markham
Mr. Speaker, I
to
suspect the reason why the U.S. budget is only $10 million is because, as we heard before, under Barack Obama, they slashed the massive budget under George Bush because George Bush's Office of Religion Freedom used it as a Republican hiring tool, is what we were told. And $5 million, I know a little bit about money and economics. You can't do any. He says that $5 million will be used for programs to defend religions around the world.
He's smoking a
Come on. It's going to cost a few $1 million just for the bureaucrats and the travel. You're left with, say, $2 million. Programs to defend religions around the world, like about 5 of them. This doesn't add up.
Time for a very brief question or comment. L'honorable député de Vaudreuil-Soulanges.
The honourable member for Vaudreuil-Soulanges.
I think the last thing, I've been sitting here for a few hours now, and the last thing that Canadians want to see is partisan sniping or politicians fighting in a church over a microphone for the right to speak or such actions like that. Canadians want to see concrete actions on the international scene to improve situations. So I would ask the honourable member, what would those concrete actions be that we should take, all 3 parties should take to improve this situation?
Member for Markham Unionville.
Well, I agree with the comment that we shouldn't be too partisan. I didn't think I was being too partisan. I gave a long list of the points on which we agreed, and I expressed skepticism that anything real would come out of this. This is an honest approach, and I haven't heard much evidence that there is much meat coming out of this. And in terms of the impact of this Office of Religious Freedom, I would estimate that the 2 visits that my colleague from Mount Royal made to Egypt when he was Minister of Justice would do a lot more than this Office of Religion.
I'll have to I'll have to stop the honourable member there. It's just time for questions and comments has expired. The honourable member